Let's make a stylized lighthouse. Add a cylinder, lower the X division, and then uncheck constant density to lower the Y and Z divisions. Make sure the X division is at 12. Click on radius and adjust the yellow control points for a tapered effect. Make sure the camera is set to orthographic, as it will help with sculpting and masking later. Duplicate and scale downwards and adjust the radii for the base. Duplicate this again and scale upwards with the green cone for second base, and duplicate one more time for the top. For the cylinders on top, click on radius so that you only have one control point for the radius. Duplicate again and make the top one a little bit wider. Make some small adjustments if needed. Then duplicate the bottom cylinder and add a hole by clicking on hole. Use the blue control points to adjust this hole. This will be for the railing. Duplicate the cylinder one more time for a smaller cylinder. Under the Symmetry tab, make sure all planar symmetry is turned off and increase the radial Y to 12. This will match the symmetry of the cylinder. Click on Mirror to see the symmetrical copies and click Validate when done. Since there are a lot of objects in the scene, you might want to simple merge some of them. Add a UV sphere and lower the subdivision. If it helps, if you want to see through the object, change it to blend mode and lower the opacity. This can help you see through the object and place it better, and when you're done, change it back to opaque. Then use the trim tool to trim away the bottom. Make sure your settings is set to two-sided turned off. With the mask tool, mask everything except for the top ring, and use the trim tool to trim it away. Now you have a dome with a hole in it. For the cylinder under the dome, mask the top face and trim away the bottom. Clear the mask, and mask the circle on top, and trim again. Now the lid is complete. Next, for the main cylinder, change the setting to inverse culling. Now you should be able to see the back face. Using the tube tool, draw a straw and lower the divisions so that it is low poly. When satisfied, validate, mask the ends of the straw, then invert the mask and trim. Now our straw has holes on either end. To make the water inside the lighthouse, duplicate the cylinder, mask the bottom, and use the gizmo to move the top face downwards, scale it, and rotate it. Turn off inverse culling, and use the Move tool to add bumps to the surface of the water. Add another sphere, lower the division, and duplicate and resize to get a set of bubbles. Duplicate this set of bubbles a couple more times inside the water. Add another sphere for the jellyfish and lower the subdivision. Mask the top half and trim away the bottom, and use the gizmo to reshape this low poly jellyfish. I inverted the mask and moved the middle ring downwards a little bit to get a flaring out effect. For the tentacles, you can use the tube tool to draw in some random squiggles and reshape it from the side. Or if you want to go for a spiral effect, add a zigzag, then add midpoints to the edges on the zigzag. From the side view, move these midpoints in an alternating fashion. The first midpoint will go backwards, the second one will go forwards, and so on. Adjust the radii to your liking and validate when done. Then scale if you want to, and duplicate this tentacle a few times for the other tentacles. Use the Move tool to adjust the shape slightly. And that's it for the jellyfish. Resize and put it in place, and next we'll make the sponges. For the sponges, add a cylinder, lower the division, click on hole, then shrink the hole with the blue control point. I lowered the vertex count even more because it will be smoother after subdividing. Adjust the yellow control points for a tapered effect. Subdivide with multi-resolution with flat subdivision turned off. Now the shape is rounded, and we can duplicate and resize this to fill in the rest of the sponge. Resize the sponges and put them at the bottom of the lighthouse. And use a larger move brush to adjust the shape a little bit. The seaweed is just a plane with divisions only set on Y. Lower the X division to 0 and scale the plane into a long rectangle. Validate and use the Move tool to adjust the shape. After adding some thickness variation in the seaweed, I then use the Mask tool to mask parts of it, blur the mask, and use the gizmo to rotate. This way, the seaweed isn't flat. Add some more variation with the Move tool. Then subdivide with multires. Just like with the sponge, because the shape is low poly, it becomes smoother after subdividing. Now we can duplicate and rotate the seaweed, and fill in the rest of the shape. When satisfied, merge the seaweed together and place it at the bottom of the lighthouse. I took a step back and made some small adjustments to the lid and the water. The rocks below the lighthouse are simply modified spheres. I add in low poly spheres, then use the project tool to flatten the bottom of it. With the move tool, adjust the shape of the sphere so that it looks more like a rock. For example, flattening the sides and the top. When satisfied, I duplicate this rock a couple more times around the bottom of the lighthouse, adding in some variations in size and using the move tool to modify the shapes. The background is just the giant, low poly cylinder with inverse culling checked. I move the background cylinder up so that the bottom aligns with the bottom of the rocks. Because some of the rocks were sticking out, I used project with inverse turned on to flatten the base. Finally, the light from the lighthouse is a modified cone. I lowered the subdivision, rotated it 90 degrees with snap turned on, and shrank the radius with the yellow control point. For the water, I cloned the background cylinder and shrank it. Although we can't see it, if we turn off inverse culling, the top face of the water is still there. Optionally, you can remove the top face of the water by masking the bottom, trimming everything away, and clearing the mask. Don't forget to turn on inverse culling again after you're done. We can finally start coloring. Set the shading to unlit. Let's paint the water first. Mask the top half. Pick a color for the bottom half. Then invert the mask and paint the top half a different color. Because our shape is low poly, this should naturally create a gradient. Add some base colors to the other shapes. To add a gradient to the jellyfish, mask out the area, blur it, invert the mask, and paint the second color. For most of these shapes, I use two colors, a darker one and a lighter one. I didn't have a color theme in mind, but I tried to stick to pastel colors that were a little bit desaturated. The rocks were a pale yellow and also had some color variation. And I went for a sunrise-sunset background and tried to stay close to existing colors for consistency. And for most objects, I also repeated the gradient effect where I masked the top and darkened the color on the bottom. The coloring's done, time to add outlines. For any closed shapes that do not have inverse culling turned on, for example the rocks, I duplicate the shape, add a new layer, then use the inflate tool, set it to grab dynamic radius and set the fall off to constant. On the new layer, drag to inflate the duplicated shape, turn on inverse culling. On another layer, add some darker color and adjust the visibility for both the inflate and the color until the outline looks better. For shapes like the seaweed or the jellyfish cap, because they aren't closed shapes, first we have to extract a very thin shell, and now we can apply the same thing as before by inflating on a separate layer and coloring and adjusting these layers. This is the same for the jellyfish cap, which is also not a closed shape. Most shapes are closed shapes, so they follow the same pattern as the rocks. For example, the jellyfish tentacles, the bubbles, and the railing. The straw is not a closed shape, but the same method works on it too, because we only need to enclose the outside. For the cylinder of the lighthouse, duplicate and scale upwards along the green cone. After changing some color choices and adjusting the lighting, here's the final result. Thanks for watching!